Coming up on today's podcast.
Each time you go up a level, like we've gone up a level in this last week with DeepSeek, you also have the potential to make the answers more accurate, more relevant, more consistent, more plausible. Well, you don't want them being plausible if they're wrong. That's one of the problems at the moment, which is that AI's, their strongest ability is to sound plausible, even if they're talking complete bollocks. Instead of just throwing more computing power at a problem, which is pretty much what AI developers were doing, without thinking too much about the consequences or the economics of it, what's actually happened is that they've looked at how these models work and they've said, do we really need to do everything like the so-called weights to the elements that make a neural net recognize things or reject things? Do we really need to give those 32-bit precision when 8-bit seems to be just as good?
Hello and welcome to another edition of How to Understand Today. And amazingly, we've made it to episode 5. I'm Simon Wyndham.
I'm Dave Shapton.
I'm Phil Rhodes.
And today we're going to start by talking about the DeepSeek story, this Chinese firm that's come up with an ultra-efficient LLM system. And yeah, Dave, give us a bit of background to what's been happening.
Well, if you've been watching establishments like the BBC covering this, you might be a little mystified because they describe AI as something that answers your questions, which is true, but only about 0.1% of what an AI actually is. But so we know that the large American companies are spending billions on huge data centers full of these magic chips called GPUs, which are just incredibly effective for AI. And each new model like ChatGPT or Google Gemini and so on, they just take enormous amounts of this so-called compute. And so it's become established, that America is the leader in this kind of thing, although some of the leading people in America are actually Brits, like Demis Hassabis and 2 or 3 others actually, who really got the whole AI thing going. Doesn't matter if we put them all in the category of, Western AI developers. So we've got to a sort of default stage where America is taken to have the lead in this, and they appear to have spent the most money. ChatGPT was the fastest download ever for any app when it came out about 2 years ago, in a few days that people are now call the ChatGPT moment. But what's happened now is that not the Chinese government, not some massive Chinese conglomerate, but a bunch of ultra clever, inventive Chinese developers for what is effectively, metaphorically, a shoestring budget, a small fraction, tiny fraction, millions instead of billions, let's say, have built something that is, by all accounts, better than the best American AI models. And it's just breathtaking that they've done this. Now, we'll know in a few days how good this actually is because the whole world has downloaded this and every AI lab in the world is, sticking things in it to see what it's made of, how good it actually is. But it certainly does appear to be credible. And the immediate effect, panic, I think it's reasonable to say, but the markets have reduced the value of NVIDIA by 15%. Now, 15% of nearly 3 trillion is a lot of dollars. And in any other realm, that would be a catastrophic, if not incomprehensibly large amount of money to lose. It's actually, you can't dismiss it as noise, but it is all part of the irregularity that you get when you look at any market and you zoom in on one day and it goes down by 15%. You may find the next day or the next week it goes up by 20%. So we can't draw any conclusions at the moment. But the reason it's happened to NVIDIA is people are assuming that you don't need to buy all these GPUs anymore because you can run it on your Sony PlayStation. Well, not quite, but it's it's a dramatic illustration of how volatile and what a precarious investment these high-tech stocks can be.
And of course, do we want to hazard a guess as to who might have been behind the DOS attack on DeepSeek very after it launched? We better not go there.
No.
I suppose the sort of first point of contention I have with this, and I have a few, I always like to sort of step back from these things and like look for reasons why this might not be the next epoch. My first objection to all this stuff is, yes, okay, the market value of this thing is reduced and that's unequivocal, and we know that because it's published data and it's publicly available. I'm a little bit cautious about drawing threads directly between the technology and the market value of these organizations, because it's not as if the financial system has shown itself to be particularly resistant to panicking. In 2008, they notoriously panicked over something they did and had been doing for years and knew they were doing, and then panicked about it at some arbitrary point. And okay, fine. I mean, NVIDIA is still the only company in the world that can make these large, very high complexity, very high performance single pieces of silicon. Nothing has changed. If you can do more with those pieces of silicon, then historically we have not chosen to go, oh, well, in that case, we'll simply build less powerful computers and run this new software on them. We'll just build better software.
Indeed, the Chinese were using NVIDIA chips, just not
exactly
the high-end ones.
The fact that we've managed to get more out of these chips does not make them less useful, and makes them more useful. And I think the idea that this represents a reduction in the value of this company is absurd, and I would argue with the markets. And I think you can't, at some point you can't argue with the fact that that's what the market value of this thing is. That's a fact. But I'm one of these awkward people who thinks that sometimes the markets are not a particularly useful or good way of doing anything.
I agree with that, but arguably the company that's taken the biggest hit, although I haven't seen their valuation, is OpenAI, because they kind of started it all off with ChatGPT. There's one other thing I wanted to say about this, which is that, for a long time, the West, and particularly the Americans, have restricted the supply of the latest generation of computer chips and technologies to China. And this has had an unintentional consequence, which is, I think, analogous to antibiotic resistance, where if you just dole out too many antibiotics, then they'll be effective. But at some point, there will be just like 1 in a million microbes that survives the antibiotic because it is resistant to it through some, fluke of chemistry or DNA. And it will go on to be the ancestor of trillions of these resistant bacteria, so viruses, not viruses with an antibiotic. So what's happened in this case, I think, is that by restricting the availability of the latest hardware to the Chinese, I hate using that term because it's a country with billions of people, but I mean to the Chinese AI research industry. So they've just had to be a bit clever. They've had to become super developers to produce these models that work on older equipment. So it's the same effect. By restricting the supply, you've ended up with something that's stronger. I don't have an answer to that on a geopolitical level. I don't know. But I think that's what's happened here.
It's very much like, older computers, isn't it? When we didn't have the computing power that we did now, everyone had to be as efficient as possible with their programming to get things to work. And this is no difference, really.
And we gave that up. We gave that up because computing effectively became abundant. And so you then moved to higher and higher level programming languages. And you almost didn't think about what went on at the low level. In the early days, you'd have to code for every single bit and byte and move it between the registers on a microprocessor manually. Now, we're so abstracted from the hardware that nobody gives a toss. So that is, the enemy of efficient programming. Now, if you went back to writing in assembly language, you'd end up with something that probably runs 100 times faster, but it also takes 100 times longer to write.
So Dave, explain a bit about what has made this particular model so much more efficient. I mean, what actually, at the core of it, what actually makes it so much more efficient than ChatGPT and other large language models?
Well, overall, it's exactly what I was just talking about, which is it's this mindset that instead of just throwing more computing power at a problem, which is pretty much what AI developers were doing, without thinking too much about the consequences or the economics of it, what's actually happened is that they've looked at how these models work and they've said, do we really need to do everything like the so-called weights to the elements that make a neural net recognize things or reject things? Do we really need to give those 32-bit precision when 8-bit seems to be just as good? I mean, this is an oversimplification, but if you've identified a chair, you can probably identify a chair just as well with 8 bits as with 30. The other thing they've done is they've changed the way they do so-called embedding, which is the process of taking tokens and putting them in a vector space where they relate to each other, a little bit like, a calf is to a cow what a lamb is to a sheep, what a puppy is to a dog, for example. And yet on another level, they're all animals. So all these relationships, these are called parameters, and there are literally, you can have trillions of them. But what they've done is when they take data in the form of language, and language isn't amenable to this kind of digitization. So what they do is they turn it into tokens where they fairly randomly cut it up into chunks of text. And then they look to see how often these chunks, these tokens, crop up. It sounds like an ineffective way of doing it, but it's no different from digitizing sound or video. You do mangle it to some extent, but the end result works extremely well. So what they've done is they've actually gone for larger tokens, which are almost like a whole phrase. And by doing that, they reduce the number of tokens. So they encode it in a lower precision and they use larger tokens. And then the final major thing they've done is what's called imagine instead of having one expert in everything from nuclear science to fishing to crochet, they've divided the thing up so that if somebody is making an inquiry about crochet, they're not going to activate the whole thing such that they also activate the bit that knows all about neuroscience. So if you think of it as a room full of experts, they only activate the experts they need. So that makes it much more efficient to actually run. So those first two make it more efficient to create the model in the first place, and the last one makes it more efficient to run. And there are some other optimizations as well. I don't think any of them are a surprise to any expert across the whole international field, but the surprise is that somebody's gone ahead and done it, and it's so damn effective.
And I think something else there is that now that has been shown to have been done, it might pave the way for other companies to develop this kind of thing who don't have the kind of resources that were previously thought to be.
Totally. It breaks a logjam. And it also exposes the myth that you do need this massive amount of compute. But what will happen is nobody's ever said we've got too much compute. Nobody's ever done that. So what will happen is that you'll run this model using these techniques, using the massive data center scale compute, and you'll end up with something even better. And on the way to that, you'll cross a load of other thresholds where we said, oh, we didn't know that was possible, or we thought that was years away. So what this has done, arguably, has taken us, in terms of people's imagined timescales, it's taken us maybe 5 or 10 years closer to AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. We all know that the scale is not like that. The time scale, the timeline is much, much more compact than that. So it may actually have only taken us like 3 months further ahead. But in that 3 months, because the rate of change is almost vertical now from our perspective, we will have had massive improvements and developments. So, I mean, this is kind of hinting at what the main theme of this talk was intended to be before we got onto this AI development, which is understanding exponential change. So, Simon, I don't know if you want to just introduce this section.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are, we've, as you say, this was the original topic, and obviously news overtook us, but the original plan was to go straight ahead and talk about exponentiality and how technology progresses. But of course, there's a lot to exponentiality and a lot of nuance. For example, the way in which organizations adapt at a different rate to the speed of technology. So, Dave, you're probably much more of an expert on this than me again.
I'm an exponentiality nerd, I'm afraid. I've been watching this happen for, decades. But in 2005, Ray Kurzweil, an inventor and somebody who's been involved with AI since the earliest days with people like Marvin Minsky, he wrote a book called The Singularity is Near in 2005. And just very briefly, the singularity is the ultimate consequence of exponentiality. We'll come back to that. But last year he wrote a book called The Singularity is Nearer, which is almost a bit of an in-joke if you didn't read the first book. But almost every prediction he made in 2005, when we would reach this so-called singularity, when things are changing so fast that from our perspective, they happen instantly. He predicted that would happen, around 2030. And, well, look what's happened. Almost everything he predicted in terms of this timescale is not only on the same path that he predicted, it's actually reinforced almost everything he said. So I think Kurzweil is very good, and I think he kind of loses it a bit when he goes into the distant future. But certainly, if you needed a framework for understanding today's developments and rate of change, you can't go wrong reading The Singularity is Near and The Singularity is Nearer, or indeed just the first 5 chapters of The Singularity is Nearer, where he summarizes the previous book.
Now, when a lot of people talk about exponential progress in, say, technology, the default thing that most people bring up is Moore's law, which isn't so much of a law. It was more of just an idea or a suggestion.
Observation, yeah.
Yeah, but Moore's law has pretty much fallen by the wayside in terms of how technology is really progressing. We're actually seemingly going at a much faster rate than he could have predicted. But Phil, you said you've got some different thoughts on the idea of exponentiality.
I mean, what exponentiality is fairly well understood. I mean, what we're talking here is about the fact that things don't get better at a continuous rate. They get better and they get better and better and better and better and better. And this leads people to sometimes be surprised about things suddenly becoming possible. I think that's happened with AI. There's a line from Jurassic Park, which is really a novel about technological advancement. If you go away from the dinosaurs and the people being eaten, Crichton wrote about technology. And one of the characters gives one of the characters the line, I knew this was possible, the genetically engineered dinosaurs, but not so soon. And one of the other characters, who's pretty obviously an author filibuster, I think it's the character Ian Malcolm, who's pretty obviously a self-insert by Crichton, who says, yes, everyone thinks this is going to happen, but not so soon. And yes, it is legitimately viewed as possible that we might be able to do the genetic cloning of dinosaurs thing with sufficient funding. But that's not really the point. The point is that, yes, people get surprised by the rate at which things change, and that's nothing new. Where I start to get a little bit cautious about it is, I was going to bring Moore's law up, because Moore's law was a prediction of exponentiality, which worked for a while, then stopped working. And there are other technologies which have gone that way. And one of the ways you find these is by looking at what the science fiction of the past was doing. And the assumption that we would be on Mars by now.
Yeah.
Because there are some fundamental problems with going to Mars about distance and time and speed, which are difficult to solve. Now, you can take as an example something like spaceflight in general, which has not really had an enormous huge fundamental technological advancements for decades. And there are a number of reasons for that. You can point at the space shuttle program eating up all the money that could have been used to develop other things. There are a number of concerns. And the fact that, a large amount of the progress that happened in spaceflight in the mid-20th century was politically motivated because people wanted to win some sort of race. Now, there hasn't been the advance that we hoped there would be. Let's look at Jerry Anderson marionette TV series from the 60s and 70s, and they were fully convinced that all airliners would be supersonic. But they aren't, because there are fundamental problems with doing that, and those fundamental problems have not been overcome. Now, that sort of thinking makes me cautious about assuming that the singularity is upon us, for instance. I mean, I think perhaps that's actually somewhat more reasonable since the dawn of AI, but, I always take a little caution in this stuff, and people frown at me for it.
I think what you've identified, Phil, is that it's information that gives us the exponentiality at the moment. I mean, so I completely agree with you about, if you think of jet engines, the thing is, jet engines don't help to improve jet engines.
I mean, I'm not sure if I'd agree with that, because I think one of the things that SpaceX has done, and the reason that this comes to mind, is that they have added something to spaceflight in recoverability. Recoverability that people hoped we would get with the space shuttle. And the space shuttle program didn't work very well, according to its original design intent. It was intended to make things cheaper. It didn't. Now, to take nothing away from the enormous engineering...
Yeah, it was simultaneously...
spectacular.
Incredible achievement for mankind, as at the same time as being a horrible lash-up.
Yeah, I mean, but the one I always mention with this is that there's a beautiful piece of artist impression of a space shuttle orbiter being serviced between flights from about, I think it's from the mid-70s when they were putting the thing together. And it shows that the orbiter sat in a hangar, and this guy in his blue NASA overalls with a little toolbox walking along to service the orbiter. There's a picture somewhere that juxtaposes that with an actual picture of an orbiter being serviced, and you could just about see the nose and the tail fin sticking out of this huge web of scaffolding and maintenance equipment. It didn't work to take nothing away from the huge achievement, it didn't really work, which is why one of the things that we don't see now is more single 2 or 3 stage to orbit space planes. We're not doing horizontal landing space planes anymore. Well, sometimes we are little tiny ones, but nothing on the same scale as the shuttle. And where I'm going with this is that it was necessary to do that in order to learn that it didn't work. So building a space shuttle did help us build better space shuttles, or more to the point, not build better space shuttles, but to improve spaceflight further. And things like building Concorde was perhaps necessary to be aware that Concorde wasn't a very good idea, that supersonic civilian transports were not a very good idea. And
I think with Concorde, either the goalpost moved or we weren't aware they were going to be goalposts.
Well, things like the cost of fuel were a factor that affected that, but also things like they've done research on that in the last 10 years, actually, on things like reducing the sonic boom, because you couldn't go supersonic in a Concorde overland because you would break everybody's windows, because it's this enormous aircraft that's doing twice the speed of sound. A fighter jet that's 40 feet long will rattle windows. That thing would have deafened people.
Yeah, and actually, just parenthetically, sorry to interrupt, today, a company called Boom.
Supersonic, yes.
Yeah. If you wanted to distract people's minds from there's a disturbance caused by flying supersonically, I personally wouldn't have called the company Boom. But there you go.
An aircraft company at all, Boom. I just wouldn't have gone. No, I mean, this is why I'm...
But what I was going to say is they had their first flight today that went through the speed of sound, not in a full-size aircraft, in a much smaller aircraft, but it's the first time a civil aircraft has gone supersonic. So that was just today. I just thought I'd throw that in. Sorry, Phil, you were talking about...
No, I mean, I think that there are reasons. I think what tends to happen is that when we see exponential progress, the thing that is progressing tends to hop around. So you look at AI now, I think AI is a particularly good example of this, and it's gone exponential for a bit, and then maybe something else will go exponential, and something else will go exponential. I'm particularly concerned about AI because I think that the potential for future progress is that we've got it, It's notoriously a bit unreliable and makes daft mistakes from time to time, at least in certain applications, certainly the ChatGPT style applications, which, as you correctly say, is only part of the applications of AI.
Apple's intelligence.
Yeah, like Apple's. And people say, oh, we can fix it, we can fix it, we can fix it, we can fix it. Yes, although is that going to require exponentially more compute potential? How do things like what the Chinese companies recently done interact with better AI requiring huge, making it twice as good may require more than twice the resources?
I mean, this is something I've sort of been thinking about, is how we actually measure exponentiality, because just going back to the whole idea of the supersonic passenger planes again, how do we measure what is exponential progress in that regard? And, you have problems such as the sonic boom, as you mentioned. There is research going into planes that can break the sound barrier and not produce, or at least reduce the effect of the sonic boom. But is there really a need for the supersonic aircraft in the first place? Because why did people use Concorde? They used it because they wanted to get to America and they wanted to have their meeting and then come back to the UK for their dinner and vice versa. But with the communication these days, we don't really require that. Anyone who's going on holiday doesn't need to travel to the States in 2 hours or whatever country they're going to. So is the exponential progress the fact that there isn't any need for the supersonic aircraft anymore? Have we made it, redundant?
Yeah, you've got overlapping factors there. Progress is not always complementary. Some progress can invalidate other progress, and I think that's probably an example.
And there's something else to be said here. I'm sorry to interrupt. There is something that's definitely worth saying here, is if you build a supersonic airliner today, you are using pretty similar technology to what you were using in 1960-something, I think that the original supersonic transport concept was even, and it didn't fly.
Concorde was first mooted in the late 50s.
Yeah, this was talked about. And then, of course, the 50s was the sort of, the time of huge positivity, and, we're all going to live in UFOs and it'd be a Jetsons future. And this was lovely, but it turned out it didn't work very well. And if you were going to build it again now, the technology you would be using would be evolved in every sense, certainly the electronics. If you look at a Concorde cockpit, it really does look pretty clockwork by modern standards. I mean, even at the time that when they went out of service, the thing looked pretty clockwork. You would not be using wildly different technology. There has not been the exponential improvement, certainly say jet power plant technology. Yes, it's better, but you would still be using a leaky turbo for jet, which is pretty much what a fighter jet's engine is even now. And the fundamental limits are things like you would like to run it as hot as you can. The fundamental limit is when your turbine blades melt. And that's it.
Because the laws of physics don't change exponentially.
That doesn't change.
And I just want to go back to actually just cover something that you just said, which is that, technology tends to go through an S-curve. It starts off slowly and then gets into the swing of things. And then it tails off when you reach the physical limits of what that particular... But then another S-curve will take over. Doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen with clockwork regularity, but it typically does happen. So when you zoom out, you see this overall exponential curve, which is made up of lots of smaller S-curves as each generation of technology goes through. Don't be misled into thinking that exponentiality started with Moore's law. It actually went way before that. If you look at the various industrial revolutions, each one of these was... The reason there was a revolution is because of the introduction of a general purpose technology, whether it's like the railways, which sped up transport, whether it was steam, which made mechanical power available reliably everywhere. So you didn't have to use horses or, turbines in streams. Electricity, another general purpose technology. And then, of course, electronics started out with valves or tubes, and then transistors, which is the start of where we had Moore's law. But you can go back even further than that. And the thing about an exponential curve is that in its early days, it's indistinguishable from a straight line, unless you have incredibly precise ways to measure it. So it's arguable that technology has always been exponential simply because technology improves things so that you can make better technology with today's technology. And It's just that, when we invented, the flint-based spear, that probably took us 50,000 years, the first tools. The rate of progress was glacial, and you explain that mathematically by saying, if you multiply 0.000001 to 2 by 0.000015, you end up with 0.000. I'm not doing this in real time. I'm making this up. You end up with quite a lot of noughts and then a slightly bigger number. And you can do that for thousands of years, and you'll still end up with something that is very, very small. And then you cross the sort of threshold, which is purely notional, where you start having numbers that aren't fractions, and you multiply 2 by 2 to get 4. You multiply 4 by 4 to give 16, and so on. And very soon you're multiplying 65,300, and I can't do it, the number that you can represent with 16 bits by 65,000. And that gives you enormous leaps. And that happens, the reason exponentiality is unintuitive is A, because in the early days it's indistinguishable from a straight line, and then because the rate of growth is way faster than you expect. So here's an example. Imagine, I can't remember where this came from. I didn't think of it. Imagine you've got a garden pond with some lily leaves growing on the pond. It takes 42 days for those leaves to cover half the pond. What I should have said is that each day, the area covered by the leaves doubles. So it takes 40 to cover half the pond. How long does it take to cover the whole pond? God.
No idea.
One more
day, because it's doubling every day. Okay. So you both proved a point there. Simon, that it's unintuitive.
It's scary. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and that's happening all the time. So that happened with COVID. So for a long time we were saying, this seems to be growing. And then whoa, this really is growing. And it's like, oh my God, this is a crisis. I was tracking this from the early days on the Johns Hopkins COVID tracking site. And it's an almost perfect exponential curve, because that's what viruses do. They double.
It would, yeah.
Although with the progression of technology, I mean, I alluded to this earlier, is the link between the way that technology is almost allowed to progress, connected to peoples or organizations who adapt logarithmically. So the adoption of technology will have a part in driving whether that technology can actually progress, because obviously you want to bring down costs of production by its adoption and all that sort of stuff. So, we've seen lots of promising technology in the past that simply hasn't really progressed because people just they're not interested in it, or there's fear, uncertainty and doubt, as they used to call it, connected with it. Electric cars are a kind of another example. Electric cars are picking up now, but there was a period where there was a lot of suspicion about them and whether we really wanted to have them or not, and whether they worked.
Well, the very first car was an electric car.
Yeah.
So, but I think, you're right, Simon. It's don't be misled by the notion that this exponential curve is smooth. If you zoom in, it's rough as anything. But if you zoom out far enough, the overall effect is a pretty smooth curve. Because you can't really, unless you have another dark age, you can't really get away from the fact that today's generation of technology improves tomorrow's generation. Except that when you get to what's been happening over the last few weeks, again, as Phil's explained, the rate of change in different fields is not always as exponential, because exponential simply means it's multiplication as opposed to addition. If you imagine you keep adding stuff, throwing coal on a pile of coal in your garden, throw the same amount every day or not the same amount every day, it's going to kind of grow linearly. What it definitely won't do is grow exponentially. If you multiply, if you say, right, for each successive day, add 3.2 times the amount that you added the previous day. That's going to grow exponentially. And of course, it will stop because you would, on day 84, you'd require more coal than there is mass in the entire universe. But we reach a point where it becomes unintuitive. And the way there are symptoms for that. One is that we start saying things in podcasts like, we've reached a point where it's unintuitive. And it's certainly that has happened with DeepSeek in AI, although it's not to say we don't understand the causes, but I don't think anybody was expecting it. And that's the point. It's the...
I don't know. What else did we expect? Did we expect ChatGPT to be the king forever? I don't think
but that's the polar opposite. You might hope that there was something in the middle, but I don't think, well, maybe a few people might have heard through the grapevine that this was going to happen, but taken as a whole, it's been a big surprise.
But I think that I think the reason for the surprise is the old chestnut of, yes, we all thought this was happening, but not so soon. Well, yeah, that's always been the thing. I think to find that someone has gone, people in China have been working on other CPU and silicon options for years. They've been working on RISC for quite a long time to try and make that into a decent performance thing, and they've been struggling to get up where Intel and ARM are. But they clearly want something that's not entailed away to the West, and under the circumstances, don't want to get into the politics, but under the circumstances, who can blame them? So, they've been pushing for this. The techniques of compression and subdivision in AI were known. Did we just expect? What else did we expect? I mean, this should not be a surprise, and this is why I get upset with the financial markets, who seem like a panicky flock of sheep sometimes, because they're going, "Oh no, ChatGPT isn't on top anymore. What did you expect it was going to be?" It wasn't.
Yeah. Well, I personally think, again, this is not political. This is just matter of fact. I think we've got to get away from this this environment where market forces and indeed sort of bond prices determine which directions an economy goes. I don't think anybody who wanted to devise an ideal world would say, let's leave the fortunes of entire continents up to the whims of market traders. I don't think anybody would say that. I don't think it's not radically left-wing to say that is not the best option, but we can maybe talk about that another day. But just going back to the exponentiality thing and the singularity, because the singularity is a really important concept. I tend to use singularity the way I define it, but I think it's consistent with other definitions. The way I define it is you've reached a singularity of some kind when you are unable to predict, not just when you are unable to predict, but when experts in their field, in their own field, are unable to predict what's happening next. Like arguably, some AI experts have been surprised by DeepSeek, which is a development in their own field. So I'm not saying we have reached the singularity, but I would say we're close to the event horizon, to mix a metaphor of this singularity. The more conventional definition of singularity is when machines become as intelligent as us. And I think if you've lost, things are moving so quickly that you can't predict them, and even the slightest increment on a timeline means you've had a massive increase in AI capability, then I think the inevitable consequence of that is that AI will become more intelligent than us and potentially super intelligent, which means that it's, again, my definition, it's so intelligent that we don't understand how intelligent it is. And one of the more, sorry, I'll come in a second.
Yeah.
One of the more worrying aspects of that is that we won't know that's happened.
This is true. And I think the other thing about it is that this metrics of intelligence thing is quite difficult, because people are going, oh, this thing's better than ChatGPT. Is it? Says so based on what? And not that I'm arguing that it isn't, but that one of the things we don't have is any, and I'm not sure we can have, is any sort of metric or figure of merit for how good is this AI? Let's assume a ChatGPT is a 1. What's
yeah, we have
else?
benchmarks, just like you have benchmarks for computers. But I think there's a big fallacious hole in the middle of these benchmarks, which is that, what if you lived in a haunted house and you wanted to call somebody in who had a ghost meter, that kind of, made a whistle that went up in pitch when there was a ghost. You can't do that because you don't know what you're measuring. You can't measure something that you don't know what you're measuring. So if we're at the stage with AI where it's going to start to have transcendent properties, let's say emergent properties, but quite probably transcendent properties like consciousness or who knows what else, how do you measure that? Because you can't measure something that's unexpected and that's never been seen before. So you can't benchmark things. So it's going to get to the point where our ability to benchmark AI is a function of our ability to measure it, which is to say our inability to measure these new properties. So we will end up characterizing AI through our lens, and we will miss huge elements of advance that we simply don't know are there.
Well, this is probably going to be a really stupid question, likely will be because it's coming from me, but has anyone ever given one of these AI systems the Mensa test?
Sorry, which test?
The Mensa test.
Some of them could do it because a lot of them can look at images.
They can look at images and things, but there are questions that in the past that are of the type that have caused AI systems a lot of problems in how they can relate to different things in a question.
Well, in as much as, let's be clear, none of these things, well, okay, this is where it gets philosophical, but the concept is that none of these things really understand what they're saying. They're just thinking up the next word all the time, and I think that's still the case for the new one.
The kind of my thinking was, well, Mensa is one way that we measure human intelligence or give a value to a human intelligence.
I mean, you could IQ test. I suppose you could absolutely IQ test a suitably successful AI that was a good enough simulation of a human being. Absolutely could be IQ tested, I would have thought.
And I think some of them have been, to some extent, they do struggle. But I think, Simon, it's a very good point. But my response would be, I don't think IQ tests are a very good measure of intelligence in general. Intelligence.
I agree.
Yeah. So because we talk about emotional intelligence, we talk about mathematical intelligence and cryptic intelligence. So, I think it's very hard it's going to be impossible to measure AIs. You can give them specific tasks and you say, yes, it did that very quickly. But it's quickly going to get beyond our ability to encompass the capabilities of an AI, I think. And I think we're approaching that stage. I mean, at the point where, AIs can give you stunning answers to questions, stunningly detailed responses, and actually stunningly inaccurate responses, sometimes expressed with great confidence.
I mean, there was a problem that I think I told you about before that I think one of Google's AI experts said is going to be incredibly difficult to solve. And that is the way in which AI can't seem to pick up on diversions within a question. So I can't remember the exact question it gave that this AI was tested on, but I think they tested a number of different AIs and all of them failed. They fell flat on their face. It was a really basic maths question that you'd give to an 8-year-old or something. And it was along the lines of, John has 8 apples, Susan has 4 apples. And the apples are given. John's apples are given to Susan, and Eric down the road has 5 apples. How many apples does Susan have? But the AI, just because it was to do with apples, because Eric down the road also had some apples, the AIs always added those apples onto the total figure, even though they were nothing to do with the question. And according to the Google guy, apparently this was a very fundamental problem with AI that will be incredibly difficult to solve. And he actually went as far as to say that he doesn't think they will be able to solve it very soon.
Well,
multi-step abstract reasoning,
until it's seen enough examples of that problem that it learns how to...
But would it be able to relate that diversionary thing to another question that also has a different diversion.
No, it's a good question.
This is kind of the problem, is that it's felt a lot of that's down to token sizing and particularly context length. And some of them will do better than others, but there is a tension between number of tokens in the context window, size of those tokens, and the comparative size of, how complicated a question can you ask? Because your entire interaction with the thing, if it's in the context window, is the question you're asking it, versus how much you can think about at any one time. And the way in which context fades out of these things is not always easy. And the way that it's stored isn't always easy, because you go to a website, you talk to the thing, you come back 6 months later, you can continue the conversation. How's that all been stored? You're not storing the entire brain state of a n billion parameter neural network. So how's all that been stored? How's it put back in? All that stuff. So the subdivision thing helps with that a little bit, I think. But there are some. This is why I'm always the miserable misanthropic note of caution on this stuff, because people go, oh, it's amazing, it's going to keep being amazing, we'll find compression, it'll get better and better and better. And there's always something, let's make supersonic airliners. Yeah, there's always the melting point of tungsten. There's always something at some point which is going to come up and poke you in the ribs. And I think that might be what stops AI having the very worst effect people fear it might have. But we'll see. I don't know. I'm just confident there'll be something that will upset the markets again in the future.
Yeah. And sorry, Dave, but another problem, obviously, with AI that they are struggling to solve is the problem of catastrophic forgetting, where the AI just literally in one moment forgets what it's previously learnt. And, that's going to be a big problem, particularly if you decide to put a system in charge of weapons.
And I think what's going to solve that, so I don't agree with Phil on this. I agree with Phil's reasoning, but I think what will solve that is when you have federated AI. In other words, you have multiple models, maybe hundreds of them, all working together, some of them disagreeing, but working towards a resolution. So there will be checks and balances, and where one makes a mistake, the other will say, yeah, you're wrong. Look, I can prove it. And this will all happen out of sight. So you'll just have this box of very powerful AIs spent all their time arguing with each other, but out will come a reinforced answer, unless they were all working on the same wrong premise, which one would hope there would be enough diversity in the methodology of training that they wouldn't all work on that wrong assumption. So I think, I think each time you go up a level, like we've got up a level in this last week with DeepSeek, each time you go up a level, you also have the potential to make the answers more accurate, more relevant, more consistent, more plausible. Well, you don't want them being plausible if they're wrong. That's one of the problems at the moment, which is that AI's, their strongest ability is to sound plausible, even if they're talking complete bollocks, which is not unheard of.
The thing with that approach is that that's technically quite plausible. If there's an objection to that, it's that, well, hang on a minute, if I want now 10 AIs running, that's suddenly increased the resources by an order of magnitude. And that's supposed to be fine, and we're all supposed to have one of those. There are solutions, but I'm not sure if they're going to be practical. And there's also questions already about how practical current AI is. Some of these server farms are already multi-megawatt installations.
I agree with that, but I still think there's way more optimization we can do. And ultimately, the thought experiment is, well, how many gigawatts, terawatts would you need to match the power of a human brain? Because the human brain could run off a PP3 battery. So there's a hell of a lot of optimization to do. And that's even assuming that a human brain is the best way to do it, which it almost certainly isn't.
Yes, I think I'm not quite sure if we've ever done any thinking about, well, we're doing these neural networks and we're building them the way we're building them. Is that the best way to build them? Or are we just aping the brain? I'm sure somebody...
Absolutely not.
I've not read the literature on that.
It's probably close to the worst way to build them, but it's a way we found to build them that they work at least a bit.
Yeah, I'm not denying that there will be progress and that things will improve. Certainly that's to be expected. My only position is that at some point, the exponentiality just does tend to stop, and it has in most technologies that we've seen. Things tend to...
My thinking is it's like a lot of things with technology. We progress on using certain mythology and a certain way of doing things, and then somebody comes along. DeepSeek is a good example. Somebody else comes along with a completely different way of thinking about it, and that's when you get a step change in things.
I don't think DeepSeek's a different way of thinking about it. I think it's probably implementing some fairly well understood stuff. They just happen to have done it first. Next week, somebody else will do it.
Yeah. So I think we were coming up to about an hour. So once again, I think that's been a pretty good discussion. So I think we'll leave it there. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. I've got to do all that stuff. So yeah, we'll leave it there. And thanks, guys. That's been a really enlightening discussion.
All right, we'll see you next time.